Thank you for joining the Once Changing the World, which is India's first Future Tech Meets Sustainability podcast. And today I'm delighted and honored to have with me Mr. Roger Spitz, who is the president of Techistential and the chairman of the Disruptive Futures Institute. He has over 2 decades of experience leading investment banking and venture capital businesses, advising CEOs, founders, boards, and shareholders, evaluating the most strategic transactions, competitiveness, and disruptions ahead. He sits on a number of advisory boards of companies, climate councils, VC funds, and academic institutions globally. He is the partner of Vector Partners, a VC firm investing in the future of mobility, as well as a member of the advisory council and LP investor in Berkeley Skydeck Fund. As a former head of technology M&A with BNP Paribas, Roger advised on over 50 transactions globally with a deal value of over $25 billion. So Roger, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. The conversation is largely going to be on disruption. Now, whether it's consumers or enterprise, can thrive on disruption. So I was going through your documents, and you talk about something called as Disruption 3.0. We all know about what disruption is. Could you talk about Disruption 3.0? What does that mean?
Sure. Let's go. That's a good way to dive. And thanks, Eddie, for having me on the Ones Changing the World. It's a great initiative you have, and a pleasure to be with you today. The word is often associated disruption with technology or innovation or product development. And that's probably how 95, if not 99% of the world understand disruption. And it's, probably the most famous around this is Clayton Christensen, a lot of extremely important work around disruptive innovation, but it still refers to incremental, discrete, specific rules and features which can make a particular company be qualified as disruptive innovation, or specific companies which aren't. So he has many case studies. He talks about Netflix, which effectively is disruptive innovation for Clayton Christensen, because it was targeting a different clients and different customer base. And through those, they then developed and competed with the broader legacy markets of competitors. Whereas Uber, for instance, he defined those as not being disruptive innovation because Uber was focusing on the same customer base. Even though it was an app, it was basically the same customer base, just targeting price and with a different form factor. What we call, and that for us is disruption 2.0. And disruption 3.0 is really systemic. It's a constant. You almost can't separate it one thing from the other because things are hyper-connected, they're self-reinforcing. So you might have the impact of something somewhere, but it basically cascades and amplifies and develops beyond that particular aspect. So it's unexpected, it's complex, it's nonlinear, it's a constant, and it's permanently kind of self-reinforcing and changing. It's dynamic.
What you're trying to say is Disruption 3.0 is going to be continuous. And largely, I would agree because, from you described Disruption 2.0 and Disruption 3.0. I think there's a lot of things which is happening. I think for the first time in the history of human history, we have a technology which can self-improve itself. And that's the reason you see these generative AI doing things which is like beyond what we have seen in the earlier disruptions. Now, you've also written the book Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption. There's 4 volumes to it. Would you mind to give my audience like a brief overview or synopsis of this book and possibly the 4 volume?
Thanks for asking, Eddie. That's really the key idea we have throughout the whole guide. In other words, we're in an environment which is complex, which is unpredictable, and which is uncertain, where the features we're describing as Disruption 3.0 are affecting pretty much everything. And it brings questions as to how should we make sense of this world where everything is so interrelated? What are these drivers of change? And what are the frameworks to adapt? And so what we decided to do is we were getting a lot of demand, especially when the pandemic hit and afterwards, as to what on earth is going on and what do you do about it? And when we developed a lot of executive programs and talks, we ended up with quite a lot of material which people were finding very relevant from the feedback we were getting. And so we decided to write these 4 volumes, which are the definitive guide to thriving on disruption. Volume 1 is effectively the foundations. How should we understand and make sense of this complex, unpredictable, nonlinear world? Volume 2 is frameworks. What are the essential frameworks for uncertainty and disruption that can help you address it, that can help you deal with it, that can help you operate it once you've made sense of that world? Volume 3 is focused on the individual. It's beta your life. What is existence in a disruptive world? What does it mean for longevity, for education? How should we be thinking about education, work and money, the creator economy? Many of those aspects which are really focused more on the individual, maybe as an entrepreneur, but also especially as a human. And then volume 4 is your business. Volume 4, which is this one, is disruption as a springboard to value creation. And here we're looking at questions around, what does our complex and unpredictable world mean for you as a business? How can we develop anticipatory governance for leadership and boards, given that it's an increasing cost of business as usual? What sustainability and climate technology opportunities are created by the energy transition? How can organizations approach ecosystem innovation through business models as a system? How do you need to almost think as live organisms for business models as a system, as opposed to standalone company and specific business model? Everything is quite integrated and interrelated for complex problems. How will industries evolve beyond the digitization? We're kind of moving beyond the era of just digitization. So industries are intersecting, they're converging, but they're emerging as something completely different. What is plant-based protein, alternative protein? What sector is that? What is a computer chip if it's driving a car and if it's 80% of the value of a self-driving car? Is it a chip? Is it hardware? Is it AI? Is it... So it's really thinking about the future industries and sectors, what happens with space exploration. So it's taking those fundamental kind of questions and uncertainties, unpacking them and looking as to how they might relate for business organization, thinking about its strategy going forward.
Right. You mentioned about, possibly, how we go about consuming, a food that could completely change, the future of food, the future of education, the healthcare, and all of these things could change. But could you kind of like pinpoint on, what is it that is going to be, shaping the future? I mean, the business society. Maybe if you could just give a clarity around that. What are those tech stacks? What are the opportunities over there?
Despite being a futurist, futurists actually don't predict the future. So what we're not trying to do is sort of say, this is exactly what will happen. What we're trying to do is unpack the different degrees of uncertainty, appreciate the underlying drivers of change, think about how they might connect and what might be the implications and next order implications of those. So to answer your question in terms of what do we see as, if you simplify it and sort of say, okay, a lot going on, what are those drivers of disruption? What are those underlying drivers of change? And you're right to put the language you did, which is, I think you mentioned opportunities and you also meant, things that could be negative. And we use disruption very much in the same neutral way. Most of the time, disruption is neutral. It's not necessarily positive or negative. It's really just an ingredient to change. And what will make it positive or negative is often going to be, how you see the world, which is why we do what we do to try and help people see the world maybe slightly differently. How you prepare for those changes, and then how you respond when changes arise, especially those you might not expect. And that will impact disruption. So for us, we divide those drivers of disruption, those drivers of change you're asking in your question, into 5 clusters. The first cluster is what we call new change. It's basically a combination of factors, which means that whether it's technology or other factors, new business models, they're self-reinforcing, they're combinatory, and they're cumulative. So we talked about generative AI, but it's also, take housing and 3D printing and materials technology, or that you can print a human part of the body. And it's many, many aspects which are really a type of change where the more things are connected, where the more things are cognified, That new change is a combination of things, often technology related, which is very important. The second cluster we consider to be what we call a hyper premium on relevancy. That it's harder to stay relevant today, whether it's machines, whether it's democratization of information, whether it's a number of factors, AI. It's also a positive thing if you're a young girl in the south of India and you maybe, with the $30 smartphone, you can probably have as much information as a Harvard professor. So it works both ways, that the barriers to stay relevant are kind of higher and shifting. The third cluster is very important and a key part of your show. I've listened to some of your other podcasts, and these are common themes, which is irreversibility. We put three things in irreversibility. One is climate, because for obvious reasons, if at some point you can no longer live on the planet or things are degraded to a point, you can't come back and sort of say, oh, we did wrong, we need to reverse that. The second irreversibility element is tech, and the third one is AI. And we separate tech and AI because AI has specific impacts in terms of human decision-making. So that irreversibility is a kind of feature of disruption, of change, which is very different from something that is not irreversible. The fourth cluster we call systemic paradigm shifts. These relate to societal paradigm shifts, the way information, with the disinformation, information, fake news, alternate realities, the splinter net, and then complexity, how everything is complex. I mean, the world is not more complex today than 100 years ago. The world is what it is, but probably there are features of society, of work, of many things which bring complexity to the forefront. So that fourth and penultimate cluster is really systemic paradigm shifts, and it's information, complexity, and society. And the fifth and final one is what we call rapidly approaching paradigm shifts. In other words, they haven't yet hit us, but they are in the making and the writing is on the wall. One is new frontiers in global reshuffling. So that's India becoming, probably very soon the largest, most populous country in the world. How much of the world population will be non-US, non-North American, non-Europe? Within not a long time, maybe those parts of the world will be 20, 30% of the world population. And as countries like India, parts of Africa, Southeast Asia continue to grow and become more wealthy, maybe now those populous regions represent 20 or 25% or whatever of global GDP. Little by little, it might be 50, 60, 70% GDP. In other words, US and Europe becomes much less relevant. And then the other part of the rapidly approaching new areas is what we call quantum and artificial life. What are the paradigm shifts? And, if you do reach quantum supremacy, what does it mean if you can create inorganic life? And, AI is one thing, but it's not life. It's just algorithms. What if that is actually inorganic life that's being created? So to take a step back, and apologies if I was a bit long, but I think this is a key part of your show. You're looking at these drivers of change, which is a new type of change, which is a hyper premium on what it means to actually stay relevant for society, for a country, for individuals, for organizations. You're looking at irreversible features around climate, tech, and AI. You're looking at systemic paradigm shifts, and you're looking at those rapidly approaching new eras, which themselves would be quite transformational. And everything of what we discussed is very linked, hence the idea of systemic disruption.
I mean, you gave out 5 pointers, which are the forces of change, the possible of completely new things which the world could see. The quantum computer, the way we kind of compute, it could completely change. We'll go from zeros and one, the binary, to, computing with the source code alive, and what would that mean when we have like a working quantum computer and artificial life itself. I've had the opportunity to kind of speak to a lot of leaders at the forefront of, source code alive. Mm-hmm. Now, in all of these like complex dynamics which is being played out, what would be your advice to, a layperson, a common man, or a business? Are there some insights you think that could help individuals and businesses?
The most important and effective, which unfortunately is not is not being done at a societal level is really for countries, for institutions to realize that the current governance structures, that the education systems, that the incentive structures are not adapted to this deeply uncertain world where there's so many variables and uncertainties. So you still have an education system, whether it's, I'm not even just thinking about generative AI, I'm just thinking about what we've been discussing about the extent of how deep these uncertainties are. The educational system is really still behaving in a way that is preparing you, it's knowledge-based, it's focusing on past events a lot. It's focusing on things which increasingly AI will be able to do. So a lot of it is kind of education, and changing the education system is difficult at an individual level. Having put that aside, and that really is what the world needs, but it's not very, very fast in doing so. To answer your question to what individuals and businesses can do, I think the key lever for change and for thinking about this is really education in the broader sense. In other words, first of all, it's becoming aware of these things, becoming aware that unfortunately the educational systems and many other of our structures are letting us down. So we need to be more proactive, and we can't just rely on past experience, on what we've learned, on playbooks and the more conventional things which we find a lot of. We need to think about understanding this world. So first thing is kind of education, knowledge, awareness. The second thing is that you need to slightly change the way of thinking about the world, right? You need to learn how to make sense of a world which is less kind of linear and predictable. So get comfortable with uncertainty. And you need to not only make sense of it, but know how to respond to it. And the final thing I would say is you need to think about that as an opportunity. Change creates opportunities as well. If things were predetermined, it would mean that there's no change and you have no freedom, agency, and choice. A lot of these changes give you freedom, agency, and choice, but you can't just sit there and just wait to be fed. You need to have the agency, exercise that freedom to seek out this understanding, to learn how to make sense of it. And it's really survival for a lot of businesses and individuals. There's literally an existential risk at the level of different strats of society. There's existential risk for the entire world with a lot of what's happening. And there's also existential risk at the level of society or humans if they aren't able to kind of think beyond some of the scenarios which if they don't seek the opportunities and have the agency to develop a new mindset, where basically things are not looking that good. I believe that it will be increasingly challenging, whether you're business, an individual, society as a whole.
Right. So yeah, you rightfully pointed out, I think the core of leveraging the good things of the future is to change your mindset, be curious, be for what tomorrow is going to bring, try to learn, be open. And you rightfully pointed out, I think the education system is letting us down, and the conventional form of education, I think, is no longer relevant for the new world, because the new world is demanding that whether it's an individual or a business, they have to be a lifelong learner. And most of organizations, I mean, whether it's governments, whether it's education institutes, whether it's the banking industry, whether it's politics, I think they've all functioned in a way where they've never been held accountable.
Yeah.
The world today is asking, like, at least the youngsters are asking really deep questions. And there are tech stacks, the Web3, the blockchain, the Metaverse. I mean, and the ethos behind blockchain is really cool. The transparency over there, interoperability, taking the middleman out of the pictures. Now, there is too much of idealism in some ways. I don't know how far that's going to work. But then if you take some bits of it and try to figure out a way, I think we can look at the entire world, and all the institution systems need a complete reinvention, because so far almost all the organizations, businesses, banking industry works on a top-down hierarchical manner.
Yeah.
And so talking about blockchain, maybe would love to hear your views on this new tech stack, blockchain, Web3, Metaverse, and generative AI. How do you think that's going to change the world?
The question around decentralization and Web3 and Metaverse and all that, I mean, I try and take quite a kind of simple view. I mean, simple, I don't know, but a view kind of trying to kind of away from the hype. I think what happens is, why do we miss inflection point and how does the hype happen? It's a combination of two things which are kind of paradoxical, and I try to kind of appreciate those. One is Amara's law. So Amara's law, as you know, but for your listeners maybe, or some will probably know as well, but Amara's law is you tend to kind of overestimate the impact of an innovation of technology in the short term, but maybe underestimate its impact in the long term. And then the opposite kind of effect is exponentiality, which is the change is happening and quite fast and significantly, but it's happening on small things on a small scale. So it's indiscernible at the beginning, like the pandemic. And then it's only at the end when it's too late that you suddenly notice it. So what happens with a lot of these technologies is that there's a confluence of what we call the inflection paradox, which is you get bored and blasé of all these things early on and don't notice so much the exponentiality of it. And then it actually may be even more important later than you realize. And plus it's exponential, so suddenly it hits you. Like generative AI, people didn't notice, natural language processing and visual recognition, image recognition. And if you put those two together, what does it suddenly mean as an inflection point? So the way we look at all this decentralization, blockchain, immersive, is that we believe that it is the direction of the way things are going. We believe that there is an element of decentralization enabled by technology, not just blockchain, but just many things which don't require command, control, hierarchical, whatever structure, whatever that may be. And we do believe that there is a movement which is very significant and real towards virtuality and immersion. Anything that can be virtualized, digitized, will be decentralized. So whether you call it the metaverse, whether you define it in a specific way, whether you want to put a date as to what it is, honestly, it doesn't matter. The point is that people are spending more and more time in immersive environments, that gamification is affecting all generations, all sectors, from education to healthcare to all kinds of things. And that this idea of what is the real life and IRL versus virtual is continually going to encroach on an increase of virtualization, digitization, decentralization, etc. And I think that's the important thing to register, that is for real, that it's significant, and not to be too hung up with the specifics of a technology or a form or specific date or when it will impact this and that. And to understand the dynamics of what Amara's law does to you in terms of ignoring certain things because they get too hyped and the Gartner hype cycle and that, not to try to predict, but to really look at the fundamental drivers of change, all of that which we labeled early on as new change. Effectively, all those are features of new change. And that they self-reinforce each other, and that when you add them to how society is becoming, more fluent with these technologies, that has implications. So what does it mean for you as a company, as business, as society, that everything that can be digitized, virtualized, decentralized, etc., will be?
Earlier in the course of the conversation, we were speaking about climate tech.
Mm-hmm.
And just last year, UN issued Code Red on climate crisis. What are your views on the Code Red, which was issued by UN, and what are your views on the response of the nations so far on Code Red?
Yeah, listen, there's I don't think the Code Red is a bluff, right? I mean, I think it feeds into the topics that are well covered, like don't look up. In other words, it's unfortunately, like many of the things that the UN and other organizations write about, talk about, issue, the challenge is what are the responses in terms of the effect of change. I think for a lot of the countries and governments, they've historically focused on mitigation, but not enough of it. And I think now we're at a point where, in addition to any of the mitigation efforts, we need to very, very quickly and seriously at all the different levels of society, countries, and everything, build resiliency and adaptability for the change that is ongoing and accelerating. So I think one rapidly needs to move from just kind of mitigation to the resiliency. Now, some of it is progressing in a favorable manner. Is it quick enough and substantive enough? Maybe not, probably not. That's, some of the legislation, certain countries or regions saying, you can't have gasoline cars from 2035, and certain, the US put through major legislation to support the industries and the energy transition. But ultimately, it's a little bit coming back to what we were discussing earlier with the exponentiality, right? If you're gradually, or take the pandemic, the parallels of the pandemic are unfortunately quite interesting and telling, which is, one, you can't have an initiative in one country or region that's not cohesive, right? Because you can't have 60% of the world that's doing certain things if 30% of the world and significant emissions are not playing ball. So it's like the pandemic, it kind of goes through. And climate is the same. You need a kind of concerted effort pretty much globally on that. The second thing is the exponentiality, the speed with which things can then have knock-on effect, and the systemic disruption we talked about when certain climate events, and it has a cost to insurers, and then to the assets, and then to the owners of the assets, and then to the residents and the population, and then the migration, and then the economic systems of the major financial cost, and then the social instability. So these things in a world of systemic disruption, which again is not just technology, it's not just Silicon Valley and that, self-reinforce and cascade, they are major, the ramifications. And it's evident that the governments are not acting fast enough, nor are the organizations. There is such a thing as, we're focusing a lot with climate on the tipping points, and the tipping points are alarming at many levels. People much better qualified than me have written and talked a lot about the tipping points in terms of the dangers, which is why we call the climate as a disruption driver irreversible. We need to kind of not get to the dangerous tipping points. But what we need to kind of all work, continue working very hard on is the virtuous tipping points. You can reach virtuous tipping points. For gasoline cars, if you take the big emissions, food, agriculture, and water, what are the big tipping points that are virtuous that can help, those 25% of global emissions be significantly reduced? If you then take the second biggest carbon emissions of buildings, what are the virtuous tipping points we can have for the building sectors and industry that have less emissions, and then transport, etc. So in a systemic world, some of it is going to come from education and how the mindsets and how we think about the world. Some of it is going to come through legislation. Some of it is going to come through incentives. Incentives will determine the outcomes, as Manja says. So it's really hitting those different levers that allow you to change, some of which are incumbent on the government, some of which are not, in a way that's effective and that reaches the virtuous tipping points. And I think what the governments, to kind of wrap on the question, need to accelerate, and they're clearly not doing enough, is how can they support all these leverages for change, which can accelerate and amplify the virtuous tipping points to make sure that, the resiliency, adaptability, and the mitigation all kind of feed themselves in a virtuous, amplified way.
Everyone in the narrative, we talk about climate urgency. We are next to like a tipping point, when it comes to climate crisis. But countries like India, we've got the net zero is around 2017. It's not just India, but there are so many other nations who are looking at 2050, 2060, 2040 as a net zero. And it's not just nations. I think it's these big tech. They're doing the same. Are we in the privileged position to kind of ignore the impact of climate crisis And maybe talk about Techistential also, your company, and maybe your works in the field of climate crisis.
Sure. So no, listen, it's evident that it's the elephant in the room, right? There's no way that these time horizons can be, that you can have the luxury of thinking decades and decades ahead. I was at a very interesting talk just over a year ago at the Long Now here in San Francisco by Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote the Ministry of the Future. And he was saying that the book he wrote in 2019 was looking at 30-year time span for which humanity needed to reach utopia, which he defined utopia as avoiding mass extinction. And he was saying that book he wrote in 2019, which is a client fiction, so it's science fiction, but it's fact-based and science-led. And he said that that 30-year time frame, which he thought was kind of what the world and society had in 2019, with the evidence he had when he gave the talk, I think it was March 2022, 3 years later, that 30 years was for him more what needed to be done within the decade. So the urgency is there. The danger with the net zero and those things that are decades away is that it can defer the urgency of the effective changes that need to be done today, right? So there's just simply no way that is kind of okay. There is no way that is going to have the effects that are required to build the resiliency, the mitigations, and that to kind of look the decades ahead. And I think the whole idea of just focusing on net zero and something that's so far away, has elements of danger. There's nothing, if the only way to reach net zero is a few decades away, and I'm not a scientist, it's not my expertise. What it should never do is take away from every single thing that needs to be done much shorter term in a much more kind of effective way. And then there's what's effective and what's not effective. So that's kind of just broadly kind of stating the obvious, tying into what we do at Techistential. So we're a foresight strategy practice. So we think about long-term futures, uncertainties, and how to kind of imagine different scenarios and that. And one of the things we do in terms of climate is really help organizations and individuals help educate as well around what is effective for driving change in complex systems versus what is kind of surface level or just ineffective. Sometimes you have things that are ineffective because they're intentional. So someone just putting out a press release or pretending to label things as green friendly and all that stuff. That's kind of intentionally misleading and more illegal. But sometimes there might be organizations or businesses or entrepreneurs who, in good faith, are seeking to make change, but don't realize that they might just be focusing on a point solution without thinking about what is required for transformative innovation and transformative change in complex systems. How do you scale and interact in the complex dynamic world? When you take all the, whether it's mobility, whether it's transport, whether it's construction, whatever aspect you're looking at, it is so linked to so many other parts that you kind of have to look at that as a system. And so we help organizations, policymakers think about those things. I work with a number of very interesting companies, one of which is Serviced, which is focused on climate intelligence. And so it's really helping move away from just a narrative to actual decision making today, despite long-term uncertainties, despite not having all the answers as to what the impact might be. Businesses, even cities, need to take certain decisions and make certain investments today. Do you reinforce which assets in which countries against what, at what time frame? If you own 200 hotels, which ones do you prioritize to build resiliency? Where? Resiliency against what? If you're a city, etc. So Serviced is a company that focuses on climate intelligence to help really accept that there's deep uncertainty around the eventualities, accept that the timeframes where they might hit those outcomes are further down the line, but realizing that people and organizations need information today to make decisions that are deeply uncertain for the future. So we help connect that kind of emergent, present decision-making informed despite there being factors which are unknown, uncertain, and longer timeframes.
You're a partner at Vector Firms, a VC firm interested in the future of mobility. Now, everyone thought that we'd get to an autonomous vehicle. What's the drawback, and when do you think we're going to see a level 5 autonomous vehicle?
Yeah, so listen, it's always interesting because it's one of the things that's most talked about, and people have kind of predictions on that. So I'm going to disappoint you, Eddie. I'm afraid I'm not going to kind of give any kind of prediction on that. But what I would say is the following. One is that we don't focus exclusively on just, autonomous vehicles or whatever, or nor do we believe it's necessarily the panacea to the broader, things that can be done in mobility. There's a lot in mobility that we invest on that are small things that are very helpful. So some of it is thinking about even the role of AI and predictive maintenance, ways of having, even the current engines emit less, break down less, have better usage, etc. There's a lot happening in micro-mobility, which is very interesting. It's tricky, but it's effectively has zero, to a degree, very limited emissions compared to automotive. Plus, it's more friendly for the roads. You're in Mumbai, you know what I'm saying about the difference between having certain micro-mobility versus the traffic, let alone the emissions. There's a human cost of everything, So there's a lot, basically, what I'm trying to say, when you think about it systemically, and take mobility, which is indeed what we focus on, which is supportive of the energy transition, can have an amplifier and a multiplier effect in terms of certain technologies on that, but aren't looking at this magic quick fix of, if we had autonomous driving, it would be perfect, and this is the date, and let's just put everything into making sure we have autonomous driving. So as to the merits of it and the disadvantages, I think they're quite well known. They're challenges even with electric vehicles, etc. It's a question of what are the lesser evils. I think one of the things which is quite important with climate, as with many things, is that there often isn't a one clear-cut solution that's perfect. So if you kind of move each time towards just keeping the status quo, we know the status quo is a time bomb, and that is really not working. It doesn't mean that every alternative, especially some of the more kind of tech-centric, shiny objects from Silicon Valley, it doesn't mean that they are effective. But somewhere in between, there is a role for technology to support. There is a role for innovation. And even, let me just mention it because, you're in India, and India is amazing. I love the term jugaad innovation, frugal innovation, thriving on constraints, designed for rapid change, which, those authors wrote the book and coined the term, which isn't just thinking about autonomous vehicle. Final comment I will make on autonomous vehicle is I do believe, if we come back to Amara's law and to exponentiality, that there are certain use cases, like for maybe transport or other, where some of the changes in AI probably will favor an acceleration to potential self-driving cars. One of which is, image recognition and visual, and everything that's happening around that is a major driver and inflection point. And the other one is around natural language processing and that. And so, that is a pathway where for certain applications, whether it's warehousing, whether it's long-haul transport, etc., and then intercity with the more tricky everyday roads, you tell me in Mumbai how likely it is that in the next few years you have everything running smoothly as an autonomous vehicle, right?
Roger, really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. It was lovely speaking to you. What comes next for you? And if possible, could you paint a picture of what could businesses look like in the next 10 years?
Yeah. So I'll answer first the businesses in the next 10 years. I think some of the things we've spoken about are kind of a reflection of how businesses probably will look like in the next 10 years. So just to summarize them, I think one is there'll be more like business models as a system. So there'll be more like a live organism, which is very connected, even sometimes with competitors. And I'm not talking about just platform and networks. Platforms and networks have existed for 20 years. It's almost very mature. I'm talking about emergent ways of being more innovative, how the future of mobility might look like, where all the actors are playing a role in the energy transition. And I'm not trying to have a techno dystopian world. Not everything will be driven from technology, but what's sure is that things will be more connected, potentially moving fast, more cognified, more decentralized, more virtualized. And so those businesses will kind of need to think about what that means for them, for the opportunities and also the risk. The other thing we spend a lot of time thinking about is that the old-fashioned way of looking at different industries and sectors, I think, applies less and less, and in 10 years will certainly no longer apply. What is alternative protein? We talked about. What is Notco, a company in Chile, which is an algorithm that does, alternative milk for cappuccinos and that. What sector is that? Is that agriculture? Is it AI? Is it technology? Is it food and beverages or whatever? When things become more integrated, in Israel, they produce this miniature heart in 3D. What sector is that? Is it, 3D printing? Is it materials technology? Is it biology? Is it, when a computer chip is potentially driving a car, what is that? Is that hardware? Is it software? Is it automotive? Is it mobility? Is it technology, et cetera, et cetera? So this whole idea of isolating sectors, I think, will no longer exist. And the final thing I would say is that I'm hoping that we're moving towards a genuine stakeholder economy versus shareholder primacy. And as part of the stakeholder economy, one of the stakeholders is the environment, is future generations, and therefore it brings us back to what we discussed around the theme of sustainability and its different meanings.
Right. Roger, really, really appreciate you taking time being part of the podcast. I hope that the world goes into a circular economy where everything that we create fits beautifully in a circle, rather than creating innovation just for the heck of it and then realizing that the innovation has created another problem. So really appreciate you taking time and being part of the podcast. And for listeners, if you like what you see in here, then please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Thank you. Really appreciate this.